Thank you. I won't spend a lot of time talking about myself and my program, just that I am an assistant professor, that Lisa mentioned. I focus on conservation practice adoption, primarily those practices that have to do with clean water and soil health. We'll be talking a lot about BMPs. Does everyone in the room know what BMPs are? Yes, anyone not? So one is enough to go through it. So when I say BMPs, we're talking about best management practices. And these are agricultural conservation practices, a broad term that help, it's supposed to help with efficiencies in agricultural production and with
Just how the GI green industry, how is that different from the general
GI BMP?
green industry?
I'm not, and I have another one for you. Because this talk is going to focus on FDAX data, Florida has their own set of BMPs. So NRCS has their BMPs, Florida has their state mandated BMPs and manuals that go along with that. I'll be focusing on the Florida BMPs. But yeah, I need to look into GI BMPs, or they're probably linked with climate friendly. Yeah. All right, so this talk, we're going to spend a lot of time looking at the FDAX BMP program data. I imagine that you'll have more questions. I'm not posing any solutions to anything. We're going to have, if anything, it will highlight what we don't have and what we need to get this research done. And hopefully I do a good job of motivating why we need to get this stuff done. I would like to say, I'm using FDAX data here, but the views that I express are of mine and Moon's. They are not those of our department or of FDAX. I want to clear that legal part out of the way. All right, so there's a lot of work in AgEcon that looks at individual practice adoption. None of that is new. I think we have a good understanding of what motivates individual practices, but what we don't look at much in AgEcon, where I think this work is going to go, is the adoption of multiple practices. And I'm coining this as BMP bundles, like suites of practices that growers would use or adopt on their own or adopt through programs like the FDAX program. But we don't have a good understanding of what's being adopted together and what the synergies are. The synergies and what is motivating adoption, that's where I'm hoping this work will lead. But today we just want to use this data set to identify, do these bundles exist? Are growers using specific groups of practices together for whatever reason? So the primary motivation for things like this, the idea behind BMPs is agriculture has their practices, has their management practices, but try and make them more environmentally friendly where possible. There is intuition, there is some evidence, but not a whole lot. There isn't this whole huge body of work to say exactly what the benefits are if they're used with other practices. But the idea is that they're somewhat additive. So if I use two practices, I'll get more environmental benefits on the same acres, that is, I'll get more environmental benefits than if I had used one practice. That's the idea. So then if that's the case, well, it would be good for a good public good if farmers would be adopting more and more of these practices. It makes sense so how can we then encourage multi-practice adoption? So our objective, as I mentioned before, well, we want to see if these bundles exist. So we want to identify the frequency of these bundles, and if we can, specific bundles. And we're going to use this data set that I'll talk about in detail to do that. And again, the reason is we can increase environmental benefits that we get if it's used on the same ag land. We can potentially reduce the costs of BMP education and implementation, and maybe come up with more efficient programs if we can encourage growers to use multiple practices at once, as opposed to focusing on one practice at a time. So we have lots of different production systems in Florida. There's plasticulture, bare ground, sugarcane, hay. Each practice has its own set of recommended best management practices. We have lots of different commodities in Florida, or different groups, and we have different manuals that have BMPs that are associated with each one. Today, we're just going to focus on plasticulture. We're not looking at any of the others. So we're looking at, and plasticulture is a system that uses plastic in the production system. These are very high valued crops. So think of strawberries, tomatoes, peppers. A lot of these crops use plasticulture. Using plasticulture itself has its own benefits, but we're looking at only those BMPs associated with plasticulture. So we're looking at a subsample of agricultural production in the state. Now, here's where I want to spend a little bit of time. Who is familiar with the FDAX NOI program? 2 people. Okay, I'll spend a little bit more time. So the state of Florida has a list of BMPs and a very unique program. These BMPs are supposed to help improve water quality in the state. They're all agricultural BMPs. How the program works is that an FDAX field staff member will go to a farm. They will tell the farmer which practices are applicable and economically feasible on their farm. The farmer then will decide if they're going to join that program, the NOI program. They will sign a notice of intent. That's what the NOI means, a notice of intent saying that they're going to implement this practice or these practices. So I want you to keep in mind, it's very important that it's a huge caveat. The farmers themselves are not choosing the practice. They're choosing to enter the program depending on where they're located. If a farmer enters the program, they're presumed to be compliant. But in recent years, the state mandated that FDAX has to go back to these farms every 2 years to verify that the farmers are implementing the practices and implementing them the way they're supposed to. Now, participation in the program is voluntary if you're not in a basement management action plan area. You've heard BMAPs before, so if you're outside of a BMAP, you have the option to be in the program or not. But once you enter the program, you're saying that you're going to do the practices that were assigned to your farm. If you're in a BMAP, you have little choice. Your options are you either do the practices or you monitor water coming off your farm. My understanding is that this is so expensive, no farmer would choose to do it. Even the big folks just won't choose to have this option. So it's this quasi-voluntary program. And this is the data that we're using. Now, it covers most of the states. FDAX does a good job. Every year, they try and increase the number of farms that's in the program. They have about 61%. As of 2021, they had 61% of the ag land. So this is a data set that we're using. But again, the focus is on plasticulture, and plasticulture is coming from the Vegetable and Agronomic Crop Manual. So these BMPs are focused on vegetables and agronomic crops. Now, here are some of the data limitations. As great as this data set is, it's not designed for research. It's designed for FDAX. But this is what is out there, or this is what is available. So in the NOI, in the data sets where we get this NOI data, we know where the farm is. We know how many acres the farm has. We know what practices the farms adopt. We don't know what crops are being grown. We don't know on which acres the BMPs are being adopted. A farmer can report adopting multiple BMPs. We don't know if that's being done on the same acres. All of this information we don't have. So I want to spend the time explaining this because there are several caveats to using this data set and the inferences that we can draw from it. So everything that I present here on, keep that in mind, that we can't get at individual acres, we can't get at where these practices are being adopted. It is a farm level, so the acres are presented in a parcel. So it's the whole farm, at least the whole farm on a contiguous piece of land. And that's what we're using. Sometimes we have it where the program does allow you to break it off. If say you have a piece of, a large piece of your farm is on this side of the road, but then a few miles down, you have the other piece of your operation. We can see that, and we took those out of this analysis. But it is the whole farm. So part of the farm might be in ag production, part of the farm might mean something else. If a house is on the farm, that's all included. But still having these whole farm acres, I think, is very valuable.
That Broward and Dade County not on there, or the no participants, or cannot tell the color from here as long as 16,
They are not included in this sample,
but there are some.
not in the data I collected. Not program participants collected at this time. So this data is from the 2015 Vegetable and Agronomic Crop Manual. We collected this data May 2020. FDACS might be updating this. I will say most of the data for this manual is in the 2015 manual. There was a manual done in 2008. My understanding is there are still participants who are using that manual. FDACS is working on transitioning those from the 2008 manual into the 2015 manual, but there's no way for us to connect the two because the BMPs are different. So I'm using the largest, most recent, and where we have the more coverage. So to say that is in the sample I'm using, they're not included. That doesn't mean that FDACS doesn't have any program participants in there. And there are different manuals as well. This is only vegetable and agronomic crops. Make sense? Okay. It also, the data that we have also includes whether or not they're enrolled in cost share. And this is FDACS cost share. It is possible that a farmer is enrolled in cost share from a different program like NRCS cost share or water management districts. But this is kind of, think of it as a proxy. They have cost share from FDACS. So keep in mind too, these folks are in a BMP program already. That's what this NOI program is. So we're only looking at those particular people that are participating in these programs. There are growers outside of the program that are adopting BMPs, and there are growers outside of the program who are not adopting BMPs. It's not a random sample. So we're looking at 9 irrigation management BMPs and 11 nutrient management BMPs. I'm not going to go through this list. They'll come up as we go through the slides. So just simply what's being adopted, what are they, or what's being used. This is just the rate of what is being, the BMPs that are being used by the farmers in this manual. And we find that on average, over 50% of the BMPs are being used on average. And we have irrigate based on water holding capacity, rain gauge, using a rain gauge, watering frequently, and irrigation decision assistance as being those being really top practices, which makes sense. These are practices that aren't just BMPs, they're just good practices, period, right? Good farm management practices. So that makes a lot of sense. Now we wanted to break it up into, well, what's happening with farm size and cost share. So we broke up these farms into small, medium, and large, where a large farm is, 500 acres or more, which is pretty large for a Florida farm. Now, looking at those with cost share. So this is only those with cost share and looking at farm size. We wanted to see, well, what did the use rates, the frequencies look like here. And in large parts, size matters. So we find that most large farms are using BMPs at higher rates than small and medium-sized farms. And this is not surprising given what we know from the adoption literature.
Interesting that it's not linear size, right? It seems to be, the lowest is in the medium category. Do you have any information on why?
The low is in the medium.
Size, like you see it higher in small forms.
For some, no. And there's nothing in, we're not able to connect this to anything to see why. We are doing additional work with these data sets. We're looking at different correlations using bivariate probates and that kind of thing. We're testing to the different groups, but we have not, for this talk for a mixed audience, we weren't doing that. But no, it's not clear why medium is different from small, but we do see a big difference in large relative to everyone else. It could be how we broke the groups up. We are saying that these are small farms, medium sized farms, and we use guidance from the, we use the same breakpoints that USDA uses for and they're doing that for the whole country, but So it could be as simple as that. And without cost share, not as stark. What we see, what's more different, I think, is in the different practices, like mobile irrigation labs and tailwater recovery systems. That's where we don't see this big jump in large farms that we do in the others. Like a small farm here is more likely to use a mobile irrigation lab. And some of this has to do with the type of practice that it is as well. But what we are seeing with this is that it's really about farm size. It's not that much about cost share. And we also know that typically farm size is highly correlated with cost share. Now, what we really wanted to get to what's multiple adoption looking like? And are there bundles in these? So about 81% adopts more than one BMP. So the way the FDAX program is designed, people are being assigned multiple practices at once, and they're using them. That is a presumption that they're using them. But what we found is that almost 39% are using 4 practices. When you look at acres, it goes to maybe 6 practices are using the largest amount of acres, but that's a big chunk of growers who are using 4 practices. And the map that we have on the side here is just showing what that distribution looks like by county. So we took the totals for each farm, the total number of BMPs used for each farm, and averaged that for the county. So what's in blue and those darker greens are 4 and more. And then are there specific practices that you can see over and over again? And I'm calling these bundles. And we do find that for these that adopt 4 or more, there are specific bundles. There's one in particular that's adopted at a much higher rate than the others. And that includes using a rain gauge, irrigating based on water holding capacity, watering frequently, irrigation decision assistance. So what the questions I'd like to ask here, and we'll do the same for nutrient management so you can see what's happening, but are people who are adopting, say, 1 or 2 of these practices, can you encourage them to adopt 4? What's happening on these farms that are using the 4 practices? We know that field agents are going out and selecting these practices, but theory tells us if you're already adopting practices, you're more likely to keep adopting. You know, it's easier to get those who are already adopting than someone who could care less or didn't adopt anything. So it means that there probably is opportunity for those who are adopting 1 practice, 2 practices to adopt 4 or more practices. And we're actually able to see then which ones seem to be adopted more, to be used more readily. And I will say for the record, I use adoption very loosely. FDAX would not appreciate me saying that these practices are adopted. Their field agents choose the practices. Farmers are not choosing these practices, but to some extent they're choosing to enter the program. So I interchange use and adopt. I'm using it the same way.
So when the field agent comes, do they say, okay, these are the 3 practices that are applicable? Because the farmer elects 1 or 2 or 3?
They have to do all
just
of them.
have to do all of them?
They have to do all of them.
And is there a time period that they sign up for when they do the NOI?
Well, if they're in a BMAP, it's indefinite. I don't believe that there's a time limit on the program. You know, I actually don't know how it's terminated. That's a very good question to ask them. You know, they stay in the manual. One way, I think this verification process would definitely answer that question. Because if you have to go to the farm every 2 years, if the farmer has the option to not be in the program and they're not implementing the practice, then we'd see that. Then maybe we as researchers could, you know, assume that they've terminated or taken a break from these practices, or it might be that they changed their crop. Again, this is a whole farm kind of thing. And we're not talking about, when you look at these list of practices, if you take a close look, they're not that bad. You know, like here we are on the nutrient practices. It's keeping IFAS records, or keeping nutrient application records. So if you're keeping nutrient application records, you're compliant. You know what I mean? So you're in the program and you're still eligible for cost share. So for a lot of these practices, it's not that bad, but doing things like soil tests, which is also widely adopted in the nutrient management practices, look, that's an additional charge. You know, they have to go and take the soils, send them out to labs, pay for that tests, do things. So that's a cost to growers. Tissue tests, removing plastic, linear bed foot system, this is not an additional cost to a grower. But we incorporating nutrients in the bed, again, it's good practice, but some people choose to broadcast or things like that instead of putting it, holding it into the bed. So we see that for the, I think it was 11 nutrient management practices, about 8 of them are very widely used in the program. And same deal. With cost share, we see large farms are adopting more, but we don't see the big jumps. It's not as stark as it was for irrigation. You know, the nutrients practices seem to be closer in use rates across the groups. There are 3 practices, a field consultant, soil sample, and retaining surface water that is not widely adopted by medium and large farms. This is, the smaller farmers seem to be adopting these practices. And that might have to do with, you know, the cost per acre for some of these things. Retaining surface water probably has like large infrastructure costs, that kind of thing. So maybe it's not as widely adopted across the 3 groups. Without cost share, same deal, and the same 3 practices that we can't say, okay, you know, like one is terribly bigger than the other. But what we'll need to do is run some tests on these groups, which we have in other work, and see if there's any statistical difference. But honestly, what's the story here, and I'll bring it up in the summary, it seems to be more about farm size than cost share. So 8 practices are widely used by over 40% of the sample. And again, here's a distribution. And can we then find bundles in this 8? And we can. Keeping nutrient application records, calibrating fertilizer equipment, that should not be an additional cost to growers. Those 2, soil tests, removing plastic, using IFAS recommendations, tissue tests, linear bed foot systems, and incorporating in the bed. So we see that there's a bundle, there's a suite of practices that are definitely more popular than the others. And next steps for all of this is why. But this data set won't allow us to get at that. So if BMPs have additive benefits, then bundling would make sense environmentally. It would make sense for conservation agencies as well, because there's a cost to education. There's a cost to getting people out to farms and convincing them to do practices, either for government agencies or for conservation agencies. If you can get them to do 6 practices as opposed to 1, you've reduced that cost. Growers are using multiple practices, at least from in this program. But if they're doing it in this program, it's likely that they'll do it outside of the program as well. Large farms are more likely to use these practices, and this is not new. This is across the country. This is well known in the literature. Large farms are more likely to adopt conservation practices than smaller farms for lots of good reasons. They can test things more readily. They can take advantage of cost share programs. For those anecdotally, what I will hear from farmers, you know, why they're not enrolled in cost share programs, it's too much paperwork. You know, you need an accountant and a lawyer, and it's a one-man show or a family business, and they don't have the money or the resources to take advantage of cost share. So cost share might exist, but is it accessible to these other farms? So you find often that farm size and cost share are correlated. And we see more of that here. It may not be deliberate, but larger farms are adopting more practices. Also, large farms have more, it's Florida. There are lots of different crops, right? And lots of different landscapes. A larger farm might have more opportunities, more applicable BMPs on their farm. So they'll adopt a larger number of practices. So we can identify bundles of 4 for irrigation and bundles of 8 for nutrient management. And we're thinking that this can lead to more efficient conservation policy design across the board. Not necessarily for FDACs, they're doing this already, but other agencies, and there's clearly opportunity for things like that, given we're seeing it already in this sample. So I'd like to thank the folks at FDACs. They provided this data, they provided some insights. I would also, there's a note here for our funding agencies, USDA projects, and Moon is in the audience as well. Thank you, Moon, for this work. And any other questions from the group, I'm happy to, or ideas about how do we get this data. I've tried the surveys, growers don't answer surveys.
I'm just curious, if you know, how good the cost share is. If that data exists and have access to that, and how much.
I haven't tried to get the cost share data itself. I haven't, so this only says yes or no, they have cost share. I looked at the structure of some of the programs and it is limiting, I find, in my opinion. For example, FDACs might offer, you know, for some projects, 50% of a project and cap at $75,000. You know, it has these structures, or lots of times cost share are reimbursement programs. Like we'll pay for half of $200,000 for a small farmer is still a lot of money. And they still have to come up with $200,000, you know, so, but at what they're paying out, I am not clear on. I've seen things for specific projects, and water management districts have some as well. You know, they'll do some like their tailwater recovery projects, but that seems harder to follow. And some of them show the data in like per acre foot of water and things like that, you know, right. So it's hard to capture some of that stuff. So within their agency, I'm sure it exists. I haven't seen it.
You partner with them, so the person who goes to the farm does the survey for you?
There is always opportunity at some point, but they're overworked as it is. I don't even know how they're managing this visit the farms every 2 years. I don't know how you can do it. You saw the acreage full, and this is just one manual, one part, you know, vegetable and agronomic crops only, what they're doing for the rest. Yeah, but I don't know that in their new report, FDACs has a report every year. Lisa is standing, that's really bad. Okay. I don't know if they have, if they report the verification stuff in their annual reports. So every July they have an annual report. I don't know if that is included in there, but yes, my next requests, I would ask for the verification, the implementation verification data, because that's interesting as well. Our growers doing what they said that they're going to do.
So I was wondering for the surveys, if you have collaborated with local extension agents, so that they could talk with their producers about that implementation rate.
Every time. I do not send, as a matter of fact, it's the agents who are sending the surveys out for me. I would not be able to do it without the agents. So typically it would go to their listservs. We've also tried to say go to in-person events and get things that way, but extension agents, I try and involve them in the design of the survey and get their buy-in and input at that point, as well as some farmers, and then they'll send it out. They do the same thing we do when we get surveys. Right. Which is, yes.
Go out there and face to face. Hey, answer this question. I'm right here, not here.
That is the best way to do it. Yeah. Yeah.
We have that conversation constantly in our department because there's so much as a social science, we rely on data from people and getting data and trying to come up with ideas that allow us to get the data we need to give people the answers they want when it's hard to get the time to get the data. We understand, like you said, the same thing when people survey us, but we're trying to come up with some creative ways. In the meantime, thank you very much, Tara.
Thank you.